I'm Eric Green, partner at Green & Sklar, a boutique tax law firm and founder of the tax resolution training organization, Tax Rep LLC. Welcome to another edition of Tax Rep Network podcast. I want to thank our sponsors, Tax Help Software and Call ENQ. We've only taken podcast sponsors of products that we actually use at Green & Sklar. Call ENQ is what allows us to call the government and get into the IRS in under 3 minutes. Tax Help Software is what we use to pull transcripts. It's our intelligent ordering where we track what's going on with our clients overnight. So in the morning, we know of anything that's happened on the IRS side, and also what we use for our resolution forms, our offers, installment agreements, uncollectible powers of attorney, all of that. Our sponsors have special offers for you. If you want to check them out, go to taxrepllc.com, resources, and TRN podcast page to view the sponsor offers. Enjoy the episode. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Tax Rep Network on the Tax Rep Network podcast. We're going to be doing bringing a whistleblower case part 2, the IRS's perspective, and I'll explain that we have a special guest with us who's going to give us his personal opinion on this. So joining me to revisit this is, of course, Mike Villa. Mike and I did the podcast previously. It was episode 83, as well as we've done a number of webinars on this. Also joining us is Supervisory Special Agent from the IRS, Gary Alford. Gary's also been on the program when we talked about Silk Road a number of episodes ago. Gary is the Supervisory Special Agent here in New Haven, Connecticut. So Gary and I are doing a lot of work together in more than one way. You could look at it that way. But what we wanted to do, I thought it'd be great if we could have Gary on, and Mike and I have talked about before when we bring these cases. We always like to get it into the hands of CI. It'd be great to hear from CI kind of what happens from their perspective and how they look at it. Now, for those of you who don't know Gary, he's a supervisory special agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division here in New Haven, as I mentioned, which is part of the Boston Field Office. He currently serves as the fraud coordinator for the Boston Field Office. He also served as the first ever cyber strategy lead and authored IRS-CI initial cyber strategy. I'm not even going to get into this, Gary. It's so long, and we did it all on the Silk Road case. By the way, for those of you, again, who don't remember Mike Villa is a partner with Meadows Collier in Dallas, Texas. Mike is a mainstay on the speaking circuit. He's with us at the New England Rep Conference every year. He's with us at the Criminal Tax Program every year. He's my buddy when we go out for cigars and whiskey, when we can get on the road again. So guys, listen, thanks for taking the time to come and do this. And again, just as a caveat to everyone listening, Gary is here in his own personal capacity. He is not giving the formal opinion of the IRS. He's giving his own personal opinion. So if you hear something you like that Gary says, you cannot go citing him in any case that you have or any controversy you have. If for some reason you think you've got something you want to bring to CI's attention and you want to get it to Gary, I will put his email in the description below, so you can certainly get a hold of him. I'm sure he would love to hear whatever you or your clients would love to share. Mike, to get into this, for those people who didn't listen to the first program, do you mind giving the audience sort of a refresher on how the whistleblower program works?
Sure. I think from a high level, the listeners at home, particularly if they didn't chime in last time or tune in, you're going to start with having a client come to you that says, I think I'm aware of some taxes that are due another taxpayer, or some type of fraud that's owed to the IRS, some money owed back to the service. Maybe there's just some forms that haven't been filed correctly. It doesn't even have to be dollars owed to the IRS. It can be simply forms that weren't filed correctly or properly. All these are things that third parties can bring to the attention of the government. And if the government collects taxes or penalties on those unfiled forms or unpaid taxes, then the person who brings that forward can get a whistleblower reward or an award. And what they need to start with is the Form 211. So the first place you're going to start with is completing your Form 211, and then you have to spend quite a bit of time of making sure that you build that form up and give the government as much as possible to work with. one of the reasons you want to spend a fair amount of time on your due diligence is that I think the government's getting about 1,000 of these every month. So how do you set yours apart from others is one of the questions, right? Part of what you can do is really building up the detail level fact that you're giving to the government. And so if you've got this whistleblower claim moving forward, you generally want to be aware that you can collect about 10% if it's an issue below 2 million. If it's more than 2 million at issue, you may be able to get 15 to 30%. But so, in a nutshell, you're looking at what is the potential value that the government can recover. And that's always the issue here is what can the government actually collect? All right, there might be taxes due, but what can they actually collect? There might be a penalty that the government says we've successfully shown we're going to get a penalty, but they have to collect those dollars. When the government collects those dollars, Eric collects a fee, the whistleblower will collect a fee, and the government collects the biggest fee, which is the penalty and or the tax that's due. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Right. And what's interesting is, and again, we're not going to spend tons of time on this, but last time we did cover a number of cases where taxpayers brought in valid claims and the government either didn't recover what the taxpayer thought they should have recovered. It's very possible, and assuming it's not criminal for the moment, it were a civil issue, the taxpayer doesn't offer compromise, right? I mean, we do them all the time. All right. So the taxpayer, there's $1 million assessed ultimately with taxes and penalties over 4, 5, 6 years, however much it is. And the taxpayer doesn't offer compromise for $50,000 because that's all they can pay. That's what the government collected. And, taxpayers have gone to court, and when Mike and I and Walter Pagano on the webinar, we covered sort of a bunch of those cases where unfortunately the taxpayer is out of luck. I mean, you can only collect on what the government ultimately collects.
Oh, that's too bad, too sad, doctor.
Right. Well, and the other thing is the government may decide they're not going to take the case forward for what could be a number of reasons. When we were actually, before we got on and went live, Gary was talking about where they got a case, they can see it, they can almost taste it, but proving it is going to be so elusive that it's just not a good case to go forward in. Mike and I are on the defense side often. And, part of our job is if there are issues with the case, we're going to bring that to CI's attention. I'm going to bring it to DOJ's attention, because what my client is hoping is that the government looks at it and realizes, even if they think a crime has been committed or there's been a violation, it's too muddy. They're not going to be able to prove it. And that case may often go away. So if there were a whistleblower in that, the whistleblower is out of luck. You're going along for the ride with the government wherever that ride takes you.
I think that's exactly right. You kind of hit some of the more important points there, which is you get your claim in, and then the government's going to be at the steering wheel, right? So it really gets back to the issue of what can you do to assist them on their drive during the case, right? Because once they've got it, you're not in control of how they investigate it, what determinations they make, right? So if you give them a phone book of evidence, that gives you a better shot. They're going to drive it in the right direction, right? If you send them one page that says, this guy was a jerk. He owned a car dealership, and I just know he was paying his nanny out the company, right? Okay, that's great. That's not going to get a second look, right? And so how can you really build up, what you're trying to accomplish, which is to get them to take the case seriously and move forward with it?
Right. No, and the best cases, as you said, Mike, are the ones that are documented. And by the way, if you're listening to this, say, well, what if I just don't have the copies? It doesn't even have to be that. It can be as much as I have one that's active where we actually said, look, this person is running a restaurant. Here's the deal. We know from someone inside, they have 8 to 10 people on the payroll. If you go there on any given night and count the heads, there are 20 to 25 people working there. Here's what they're doing. They have the kitchen staff and some of the bar staff are all being paid cash under the table. And we've been told that there is a sales suppression system on the POS. So though I don't have any physical evidence, right? I don't have the reports. it's specific enough that the government can say, okay, you know what, this might make, even if and we bring it to, even if I bring it to Gary, and this case, by the way, is not in Connecticut, but let's say I bring it to Gary. That is specific enough where Gary can say, okay, we can do that, right? Special agents are very good at watching and counting heads. But more than that, this may be a great civil audit. Let the civil audit team go in there and let them pull the POS system and see if we have a Zapper program loaded on there. When you can give them something specific versus Mike, like you said, I think my neighbor's cheating because he got a Mercedes. Well, maybe his dad gave him the Mercedes. Maybe it's a used Mercedes. It's when it's so what's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? It's
you can't have you can't have vague, broad assertions.
Yeah,
that level of specificity that's going to give the government something to chew on, right? It's going to get that second pair of eyeballs on it and move the case forward. And keep in mind that we're here talking to Gary today, but these forms, the Form 211, it's going to, you want that form to go to the whistleblower office first to make sure you get credit. You want to be there before the government's already got a case open. In other words, if there's already a civil audit or a big CI case open, and then I file 6 months later, then I may not be timely, right? And so you want to get your whistleblower claim in, and then you might kind of go shopping around to see who might be able to go run with this beyond just the whistleblower office. To shop it around, you're going to want, again, that level of specificity of, here's exactly how I've come about the knowledge. If I don't have the documents, like you're saying, you can sit down. If you're the lawyer for someone who wants to bring a whistleblower claim, you can sit down with that individual and create your chronology, right? Give me the names. Who are the important players? Who's the accountant? Who's the bookkeeper, right? Who would have knowledge that can give Gary something to really go follow up on, since I don't have access to the bank statements, right? And when you develop that chronology with the client, that's basically giving the IRS their game plan from your perspective, right?
Right. No, and before we get to Gary, Mike, so since the last time we did this, how many whistleblower cases have you gotten?
So we've gotten a couple, and I don't know if it's due to the pandemic and people sitting at home for the past year. They're thinking about things they know, and they've listened to our podcast or sent webinars here and there. But we've gotten a couple, and not just within Texas. And frankly, all three that I can think of off the top of my head have meat on the bones, right? And and whistleblowing is not what I do full time. We have quite a few whistleblower cases and claims that come in, but I spend a lot of my time defending taxpayers who are under IRS criminal investigation, and working on other types of white collar criminal defense cases. And so I see the whistleblower cases that come in as being ones that I would give a second look to. And I think people who are now becoming more aware of whistleblower programs are realizing, well, gee, I've always been a loyal employee, but I think I'm aware of something that isn't right. Maybe I can make money on this. It's really, I think, becoming more public that this program exists. And I think people are starting to realize that whistleblowing goes beyond just healthcare fraud and some of the other, big type of media events that you hear about whistleblowers. Some of the bigger tax cases, I think, have gotten enough notoriety that accountants and finance professionals oftentimes are in the shoes or the roles that would have access to this type of data. And it's interesting to see how many of them are willing to try to bring a claim when maybe 10 years ago they would think that's really, not the thing to do, since it might potentially harm their name in the profession that they went out and filed a whistleblower claim, right?
Right. No. And so the idea of doing this again, actually, Gary, you gave me when we were doing the Silk Road program. We were talking about the Silk Road case, and you were talking about doing more outreach in this area regarding whistleblowing. Do you mind sharing, is there anything particular about it? Now that you're a supervisory special agent, and I know you got a lot of people that you're watching under you. Many of them, thankfully, are talking to now clients of mine. Actually, that's often why they become clients. What is it about the whistleblower program aspect? I mean, why is this of such interest?
Well, we were talking about the Silk Road case, and as you may imagine, I do a lot of outreach
Yep.
about the case and some of that, let's say, virtual currency and Bitcoin, and some of the new things we're doing. But I'm really a tax person at heart. So at some of these presentations, I would hear about these whistleblower presentations. I would hear from the practitioner side. And something I always drive home at these presentations is that we're really on the same side. I know we might be an adversary on a particular case, but we're both on trying to advocate towards tax compliance. And I always say, so this is one of the places where I think we could be on the same issue. So if you have a person and they want to follow the money because they're looking for a reward, well, we want to follow the money. But in one of those presentations, I think there's been a change because I think in 2018, they changed the definition of proceeds. So one of the things in the Silk Road case is we did a civil forfeiture. And so I heard the change in the law, and it says it no longer just includes tax, interest, and penalties, but I believe the law now says that it also covers forfeitures or things outside of Title 26 that the IRS has an authorization to investigate. So I just gave a hypothetical. So in the Silk Road case, we did the case and my name is on the forfeiture document. I signed it. And I remember we seized some Bitcoins off the Silk Road site. And let's say we seized them in, let's say, October 2013. Well, no one claimed those Bitcoins on the site, which were like 26,000 Bitcoins. So they were relatively quickly seized, forfeited to the government, and then eventually auctioned off. And I just know from being on the civil side, that probably was pretty quick in terms of getting separating the assets. So I just wanted to do some more outreach because I think there might be some ways that we can talk to the other side because maybe there are new ways of getting things done with the new capabilities under the law. And I also I've done whistleblower cases prior. So I think this is something that I'm not saying that we're not doing a good job with, but we can always try to look for new ways to do it better.
Well, and you know what? So here's what's funny. So for those of you listening, it was in the newspaper. I think about a year ago. The pandemic has caused time to warp. But the government seized, I believe it was the 350,000 of Bitcoin that supposedly had been stolen from Mulebrick. But it was over $1 billion in the current valuation. Had I been a whistleblower and who had called you, and there was no whistleblower in the Silk Road case, if you go back and listen to that podcast and go watch the A&E documentary on that, that was very creative and sleuthing and a lot of hard work. And I'm not going to sit here and stroke Gary anymore, but it's really impressive. And in fact, we're talking with Chief Lee about the idea, Gary, I'd given you about doing something with the documentary and a roundtable on it, because I think it's a very cool case. But assuming Mike and I Mike represents me, he calls and say, hey, there's this thing called Silk Road, and we provide the documents. Under the rule change, I could get a percentage of that Bitcoin that is seized.
Well, I'm not an attorney, but my reading of the statute says that it's what we have power to investigate.
Yep.
And usually when I understand it, is we say Title 26 and other related financial crimes. So we do Title 31, we do money laundering, and usually we're following the money. So in terms of, let's say, whistleblower type claims, and I'll just say a lot of the best whistleblower claims will probably include more than just allegations of tax fraud. It might indicate other types of fraud. So there might be other things or other avenues, other techniques that we may have at our disposal. And I'm not putting us over any other division, but we just we have some more authorities in some ways than potentially other business divisions in terms of some of those other statutes.
I think for the listeners at home, you all both raised some good points here, talking about like Bitcoin and the virtual currency and forfeiture provisions that allow the government to come in and collect funds on these types of cases. It goes back to something I mentioned earlier, that for the audience at home to understand, the whistleblower program, it does go beyond just because it's IRS, people think tax. But there's a whole reporting regime within the IRS and Treasury that have nothing to do with collecting tax dollars, whether it's FBARs reporting foreign accounts or Form 8300s that businesses are required to file. There's no tax due with a Form 8300. There's no tax due with an FBAR, but there are significant penalties if you fail to file these forms, particularly if there's a pattern of not filing, right? And so I'm just using those as examples, but there are many, many more, especially in the international regime, where you have a number of filing obligations that don't necessarily mean there's an extra tax due, but there are penalties associated with all those reports. And I think that's very important, especially with the virtual currency world right now. There's a big push. The listeners at home may be aware of this, but the service is spending a lot more time, I believe, trying to focus on folks who have virtual currency and maybe are not reporting it properly, not only on their tax return, but also on the Form 433 as a financial statement, right? That the IRS looks at. And they just changed that form to make sure people knew to put it on there, right? These are all forms that if someone files incorrectly could fall under a whistleblower issue if it leads to being able to collect more money for penalties or taxes.
So I had Darren Guillot, who is the SBSC Commissioner for Enforcement, and we were talking about the use of data. I have Damon Rowe and Hank Key coming on the podcast in the next few weeks to talk about their use of data. Damon Rowe, of course, is the director of the new fraud enforcement office, and Hank Key is the director of field collections. And what they're doing is they are taking the information from FATCA. They're taking the information from the Coinbase and now the other John Doe summonses. They're going to hopefully get information from Kraken and from Circle, and they're going to start looking at that and comparing, and have been, to 433s that have been filed, to bankruptcies that have been filed where the IRS is a party, where people with these assets have not disclosed it. So it's interesting what I did after that podcast. I did one where it was just me. And what I talked about is the impact of that. And one of the things that we're doing, and Mike, because I don't know how much collection work you guys do. We do a lot of it. And when we send out a checklist saying, here, we need all these documents, all right? 3 months of bank statements. We need, insurance, the premium, any cash value, et cetera, et cetera. What we're doing is we're automating it so that taxpayers have to affirmatively say yes or no if they had virtual currency in the last 6 years or if they had a foreign account, because I'm trying to protect them from themselves. The other thing is I'm also trying to protect myself. We had a client, Gary, you and I can talk about this offline. I just don't want to embarrass him, who pled guilty. They ultimately for evasion, but what prompted it is what appeared to be an evasion of payment, because he did not disclose a very valuable collection, let's just leave it there, that he had. And how did the revenue officer and CI discover it? They watched the documentary of him and his collection that was online. He had apparently a film crew came through and documented this very famous collection that he owned. And the point is, when it hit and special agents were coming to see me, I was at home. We had family for dinner. I left the dinner, drove to the office, and I ripped that file apart. Is this something? Because the first thing the client said is, I told you about that. And now I freak out, right? Because I'm panicked. Right. Did I cause this? Yeah, no. He didn't. He never mentioned it in an email. It wasn't in all the stuff he sent over. He did his own 433 and sent it to us. It wasn't mentioned. So I sent all this back to him saying, yeah, bullshit. All right. No. You're not blaming this on us. Anyway, so the point is that people listening in the virtual currency, in fact, you have to affirmatively ask the client. Don't assume that they're going to bring it up. So Gary, one thing I do want to ask you. So Mike and I, much to Lee Martin's chagrin, we mentioned the idea that, look, you filed the 211. I want to get that package in the hands of CI. And again, that may be just my being paranoid, but I'd like to get it in the hands of the people that are actually going to do something with it to let them see it. Lee and Mike and I did a whole program with Lee, and Lee's a great guy. They've got 40 people. They are actually staffing up whistleblowing, which I think does give you an indication of the priority that Chuck Reddick and everyone at IRS is putting on it. But at 1,000 filings a month, like Mike was saying, you got to really. The goal is to give good information. You want them to see what you see so that it piques their interest, because there's a lot coming in the door. They're not going to work all of them. What is your sense on that? All right. And again, this is your personal opinion. I know Lee's opinion is everything goes through whistleblower. We'll deal with it. Don't worry about it. I worry about it. So I want Gary and Gary's folks, assuming it's in Connecticut, Gary's folks to see it. What is your take on it? And again, your personal opinion, not the formal opinion of the government.
Hey, Gary, before you answer, I want to like set the stage here, okay? Because some of our listeners may not have listened to the prior podcast. And essentially it boils down to this. The IRS whistleblower office believes the way to bring a whistleblower claim is you file your 211, it goes to the whistleblower office, they look at the allegations, and they decide where in the IRS to send that. And the whistleblower has, at that point, pretty much hands off. You wait around, and you'll hear from them in 8 to 10 years, maybe, okay? That's the regime that exists, and that's what the IRS whistleblower office submits as the way to handle it. Eric and I take a position that, well, yes, you file with the IRS whistleblower office, and you file your 211, you want to do that, but what's the harm in also telling your local, if it's a case that warrants maybe criminal attention, for example, what's the harm in, after your 211 is filed, going to the CI agent and saying, look, this is happening here in Dallas. You might be interested in it. Maybe my friend at the U.S. Attorney's Office will be interested in it. It might prompt the case to move a little faster. That's the opinion that Eric and I take on some of these cases. The whistleblower office felt, no. We handle how it should move forward. So for the audience at home, that was the kind of the debate, and so I'll let you opine on it from your personal capacity. But that's the two ways of looking at it, I think.
So first I'll start off is, I know we talk about whistleblower and we have a lot of these claims, but let's first talk about there's some wrongdoing. So in being in CI, we have people walk in all the time who potentially want to tell us about something that they think is amiss. And so they'll come in and we'll take that information. And a lot of times in that, there might be feedback like, well, do you have this information or that information? Or you'll explain to the other side. So I know you fine gentlemen probably already had those discussions with your clients, but that's something we do. But what makes a whistleblower claim for the most part? So things can start in CI. So they can start in CI. So someone could walk in, and I've actually looked in my past and the kind of work I've done, and that's what's happened. I've had a person come in, we took some information, they said there's some wrongdoing. They didn't give all the information. So we had to have the individual come back. When they came back, they came back with more specific information. But when they came back with the specific information, then they produced the 211. They said, now I want to get. So first we're trying to see is this actually credible? Because we're not going to get anywhere, as Eric was saying, if we're chasing something that's not going anywhere. So we thought we had something. Then they said we're filing a 211. So right then and there, yes, everything goes to the whistleblower office. But what I will say generally, because I don't want to go against like what other people are saying, is that there are more factors than just the 211 and potentially what's going on, let's say, for the public. Because let's take Silk Road. Let's say someone filed a 211 at the beginning. Hypothetically, I saw a movie, a treatment on Silk Road, and his girlfriend kind of said she knew something about something. So let's say she filed a 211 in the beginning, but then 6 months, a year down the line, there's drugs going all over the country. There's damage coming to the public. Well, CI wants to know about that. We want to know about that information because we want to potentially put a stop to that and potentially do something quickly on that. So what I would always say is that depending on the claim, I would say, yes, it makes sense to me that you would want someone in the local office, because I was just looking at the numbers you were talking about. Let's say there's 1,000 claims coming in, there's 40 employees. Well, that comes out to about 25 per employee. And how many work days are there in a day? So if anyone sees it, CI employees, we work around the clock. So we work morning, and we might be looking at different statutes. So I'm not saying every claim should come in, but depending on the information. So let's say there's allegations of some kind of criminal activity, or there's things that we're going to have to get potentially access to the records. So in that Silk Road case, the reason we were able to get these Bitcoin is because we was actually able to get to the server, and we was able to actually get to the laptop unencrypted. Now, I don't know, maybe a summons or a subpoena could suffice in a perfect world, but in an imperfect world, we probably going to have to actually get access to the actual things. So I'm always advocating that maybe in a lot of cases, CI should be involved, because it doesn't always start as a whistleblower claim right from the beginning. It may start that way, but because we can get leads. But if something goes to the whistleblower's office, I'm not saying anything against that. We probably would have to wait, because we can't sometimes take action contrary. So we want to be able to see exactly what's going on with the information, if that makes sense.
No, it does. So the question I do have is, and I've had Christina O'Connell on talking about informants and use of informants, people that come in with information. And she talked about literally how they can walk out with cash. Obviously, the CI wants to make sure they're getting what they think they're getting, right? Like she said, they had someone bring in a memory stick with all kinds of information. That person had to sit and wait for about an hour and a half till they went through that memory stick. But it works for, I guess it covers whistleblowing, but even just informants. When somebody comes in with information, when I call and say, hey, Gary, I got this client, I want to send you over some stuff. What happens at CI? So you get this information. Do you guys have free reign to open a case and begin looking and starting to see if you see what the taxpayer says? Does it have to go somewhere central to get approval? For those of us who have not been in the government, can you kind of give us an idea of what happens?
Well, exactly. So I don't want to use all these technical terms. So let's say someone has some wrongdoing. Yep. So they come in, and so they want to tell us about their wrongdoing. So one of the first things we're going to do is try to assess the individual or where the information is coming from, because we're trying to figure out, is this something that's going to be testimony or document driven? Because if someone's coming in and let's say the person, you got to try to figure out what their motives are. Well, if someone says, I want money, so immediately, not saying they're not telling the truth, that person has a motive or is not they're uninterested party. So the first thing you're trying to see is like, is this credible? Because we want to see like, is there something there? And then you're also contemplating, just like anyone can imagine, how are we going to get from point A to point B? How are we going to prove this? So let's say it did occur. How could we potentially prove this? And so I would say is if someone then says they want money, there are procedures in place. You mentioned some of them, and the whistleblower in the 211 is one of them. So if we're going to do that, the good thing about the 211 for your guys' side is that it documents what you're providing, because it makes sense. I can see from the other side, they want to show everything that they did. So it's the best case scenario to show how much you're producing, because when you get to, I think they talked about those percentages, it's going to talk about that, about what you actually produce. So you want to make sure you have a good inventory about everything that you produce. You might actually be more that you produced than we're actually maybe listening to. So you might say 50 things and we might hear, let's say we missed 5, but you want to make sure to have a good inventory about what you're doing. And that's what's good about the 211. Even if we work a case, so let's say I went back through my records, I get a case, it becomes a whistleblower case. I have to track that case from the beginning to the end. And then I have to make an assessment about that information. So if someone comes in, that's how they have to think about it. First, make sure you have something credible. Think about like how you're going to prove it. So if you don't have a lawyer, you may come in. And I think that's what happened with a case I had. The person really wasn't familiar with the procedures. So the first time I kind of explained the different procedures we have. Then the individual was relatively smart. They might have went back, talked to somebody, got some information, and then they produced some records, as I said we would need. Now we opened up a case. And the first thing I thought was, how are we going to authenticate these records? Because there's a good chance the person who produced the records is not the same person who actually going to have to potentially go into court and say those are actual records. Because if there was any kind of malfeasance or breaking of the law, there's no cover letter to say, this is my standard business records for breaking the law. You're actually probably going to have to get someone on the stand. So we just had to plan out how to get those records authenticated. And we opened up a case, and we do have authority to open up a case. I won't say free reign. We have to make sure we clear it, make sure potentially related parties aren't doing too much in it, because we do work with other law enforcement partners. We also have other divisions within IRS. But if it's clear and it's a good case within venue and statute, I don't see a reason why we wouldn't open a case.
Well, and what's interesting, you mentioned that you have to authenticate. So the client that brings in, or my client, but the taxpayer that brings in stuff, you know what I'm always reminded of? I don't know if you're a Grisham fan, but there's a book called The Partner that he wrote. And Mike, are you familiar with this book? Yeah, the premise, Gary, you too. Where if you're listening and you didn't, it's actually an interesting book. The premise is an insider in a big government contractor effectively arranges for a fraud to happen, and then he whistleblows, and he has senators that are in on it, and they're going to collect the award. One of the partners discovers it, and then it all becomes a nutty adventure. But you're right. I mean, the taxpayer creates stuff, shows up with it. You're going to independently authenticate what's actually happening, not just take, the whistleblower's, word for it, right? Saying, hey, I know this is happening, and here's records. You're going to have to try to figure out a way to independently prove it.
And that's a very key point that I just want to talk about, is that a lot of times they have to remember, the information brought, we're probably going to have to get that same information from another source. So the first thing, let's say a legal team has to think about, how would the government get that other source? Because there's a good chance we can't. Now, if we're smart enough, like in the case I had, I got the individual, they didn't realize they authenticated. I got the person who the claim was against to authenticate it. Like, hey, do you see these records? Oh yeah, these are my, how'd you get those? This is accurate? Yes. So they authenticated it, so that they didn't realize that. But a lot of times it's good, that records is good for getting the case started. It's good for tracking. It's good for, let's say, the allocation and what you did. But a lot of times we're going to have to get the same records. And I give people this, and it goes back to my audit days. I remember, maybe you guys were one of these individuals. I would always do the return preparer, and I would drive a summons. And one of the things I would want is copies of all the tax returns or the drafts. And a lot of CPAs would get upset. It's like, aren't you the IRS? Don't you have copies of this? Why are you asking me for this? And I was always have to explain, just because you have a draft does not mean your draft matches our draft. Those are two different drafts. So just because of your informant records, I may have to get those same records from another source. So the first thing a law firm must think is, could that IRS get that record via an IDR? Could they get it via a summons? Can they get it via a subpoena? Or will a search warrant or a special investigative technique be required? Well, the higher you go in there, the more of a chance you may need CI on that case, because some records, unfortunately, legally, maybe you can get them from those other processes, but practically, you probably will not get those records. You have to. So that's the big thing.
Well, and what's fascinating, what you mentioned, and Mike, here I had in the same year 2 different criminal cases. One where what happened is, and this person has pled guilty. I don't believe she's been sentenced yet. I found out we were fired actually at the criminal tax day. The AUSA, Susan Wines. Gary, have you dealt with Susan?
Yes.
So Susan came and I said, Susan, I'm sorry, my client hasn't gone back to me. She's like, oh, Eric, I'm sorry, you got fired. She hired somebody else. Anyway, so what she was doing, and Gary, this will ring a bell, I assume. Client comes in, she does the return, client leaves with their return, right? And so what's happening is They're getting $1,000 refund. She does the form 8888 where you can split the refund. So she's getting $250, you're getting $750. Mike, thank you very much. Mike goes off with his return. Now she sits down and she creates all kinds of bogus deductions. Now you're getting a $4,000 refund, but Mike, you're only getting $750. She's taking the other $3,250. So that's a case where the person has their return and it is not going to match what the government had. Vice versa, the same year in Massachusetts, we had someone under investigation. First, it started as the preparer. It quickly moved to just one taxpayer who apparently took his return. They weren't e-filed back then. This is probably 6 years ago. And they would white out certain things and change the numbers, and then they manually filed a different return. So when they went to the preparer's return was accurate. It was the taxpayer themselves who were dummying it afterward. So it does happen.
No,
You know, one thing you'll never know. You talk about the records not matching what the government may have and what's going to be in the accountant's office or the taxpayer's files. I've seen one recently where there was a number of years at issue in a criminal investigation, IRS criminal investigation, and taxpayer believed he had a return that was filed. The service believed he had a return that was filed. And then we went and looked at the accounting system. It actually failed to file. It was just an unfiled return. So the alleged fraud that was on that particular return, it didn't happen. It was a failure to file, but it was the accountant's fault. No one knew that it hadn't been properly e-filed. It was rejected. It wasn't until we pulled up the system on the accountant's system that she says, oh, I didn't realize that one wasn't filed. And so you never know what kind of little nuggets you'll find.
Mike, so there you had an intent to defraud the government that didn't happen.
No, yeah.
Right.
I've talked about that. You actually have to do it.
Sometimes better lucky than good.
You know, Eric, one other thing I mentioned before I forget, you mentioned the partner and how they kind of created a situation that was hopefully going to lead to a whistleblower type award. And although that sounds like, it's a little bit of an extreme example, I think it's important for the audience at home to remember that with the IRS whistleblower program, you can have what we call dirty hands and still collect the award. And so if you participated in some larger tax scheme or some failure to file forms, whatever it may be, that does not eliminate your chance of recovery. And there's some very famous examples of that are out there. And so you can, it may impact the amount of the award, okay, but you can still collect. And that's different from other types of key TAM whistleblower actions that are not involving the IRS. Sometimes dirty hands can essentially preclude you from recovery. And so I think that's really important under the IRS program, because oftentimes people who have the best knowledge have it because they were pretty close to the fire. Yep. And so they're sometimes they're scared, and it's up to us to kind of explain to them that, well, you can still collect, but you don't get immunity necessarily by being the whistleblower, right? And
right.
So,
oh no, I've had to walk divorcing spouses off the ledge because sometimes they're so intent on just hurting each other that they don't care if they're going to go down themselves. And I think one of the more famous cases is Birkenfeld, right? The UBS whistleblower who got 40 months in prison, but did get 104 million.
Right. So at those dollars, 40 months seems pretty good.
And so that's what I'm saying is that, and also potentially for the whistleblower's protection. So let's just say they do have records and we potentially could use those records, but there's a chance it might be better practically in the safety of the whistleblower to get those records from a separate source. So we don't have to actually introduce those records if we had to. So we can get it. They say, well, how do you know about these records? Well, I was in the office and I copied them. Did you have authorization to copy these records?
Right.
Well, no. Well, how do you know these records are still there? I know they're still there. Why? I still work there. Which office? When's the last time you've seen those records? Last week. How long have they been there? For years. Well, describe the office. So we're going to ask these questions because then we might want to go in and get those records that way. So we don't actually have to introduce the record that you copied. So for a lot of ways, I just say, especially this was as good that I'm talking with lawyers, because I'm glad you guys mentioned that, because that we don't really speak to that. You guys speak to your clients about that. but I just said you guys are very well versed in what we do. So you say, well, how would the government get there? So when they come, you're like, well, I think the government's going to have to go in and potentially do a search warrant. They may
Right.
have to do it with
Right.
compulsion. Then I would say is, find where your local CI office is. And at least you could just have a chat. I mean, you guys, it's a voluntary interview. It's not a compulsory interview. They can disclose, what they choose to disclose. We can't compel them to tell us more. So they might just, it's like, I guess, like dating. They don't want to get married on the first visit. The person comes in, they kind of talk a little bit about something, and this is how it comes. And they came back the second time. You said, well, we like what you talked about. Did you get any additional? I got a little bit more information. And then they come back again the third time and said, well, I want money. And here's all the information.
Right.
And now we're on the record. We know how to deal with it. And so, it doesn't mean like anything's wrong. We both we might have the same goal to follow the money. And the person will still get monetary compensation if everything goes according to plan and everything is okay. Because sometimes there is no way for the person to know that information without potentially admitting to breaking of some trust or potentially some criminal
You
activity.
raised some good points, and I would suspect some of our listeners at home are not lawyers, and so one of the issues that you're raising could be referred to as a chain of custody, or where the evidence is coming from. And when I put my defense lawyer hat on, if I'm not the whistleblower's lawyer, and I find out that an employee has been stealing records, maybe he has stolen privileged records and given it to the government. If I can use any of that to shut that case down, you better bet your last dollar I'm going to spend every last second to try to find any reason to get your evidence kicked out the case, right? And so one of the things that Gary is raising here is, in that type of situation, the government may very well be the best situated to get the records that will help really make the case go forward, instead of the records that maybe your employee illegally copied, right? And so, and then in addition to that, that's from a criminal perspective, you also have a situation where your employer may have claims against you for copying things you shouldn't be copying. Even if you did it for good purposes or to help the government, you might still be exposed to civil liability, right? Especially depending on what hat you were wearing when you were working for the company, okay? And so there's a number of things that, when the government's utilizing their best course of action, can really help the case move forward better than a whistleblower just going in and copying things they shouldn't be copying, right?
And
that's where it takes the finesse of a lawyer to help the whistleblower in deciding how to best make the case move forward with the details we have at hand. Sometimes we have appropriate authorization for the records we have. Sometimes they don't. And you might say, wait a minute, we have a whistleblower claim, but don't go ruin what you're doing by taking steps you shouldn't be taking, right? And so that's kind of a fine line, especially when someone still works for a company they plan on blowing the whistle on.
That's where I think it's good that, the whistleblower program, and they have that term in there, whistleblower, because there are certain activities that is going to be hard to come to light. So when I'm sitting there, these are things we're thinking about because we're trying to get from A to point B. And I know, and I've seen some of the attorneys that we go up against, and they're very, some of them I used to work with. So I know they're very well trained, they're very experienced. So we're trying to see how we can get from point A to point B. And I think in some of those presentations, they talked about some of the best, when you talk about a financial crime, potentially, who's going to have the best information about that financial crime? A bookkeeper, a CPA, a CFO. It's usually someone in some kind of trusted position. So I'm not going to speak to whether the legalities of it, but there's going to be usually those people are the closest. They're in trusted position. Someone usually doesn't walk into a business that has been operating for 50 years and they immediately give them signature authority and let them see the books. And even longer, they say, oh, those are the one set of books. There's actually a second set of books that we actually keep, which is the real set of books. Right. So it's going to take a long time for someone, if anyone. I always tell people, like, when they go to the airport, people trust many people with their family to pick them up and drive them all around. But if you said someone had a bunch of untraceable currency, how many people do you know that you trust them with? It's probably less than people you could fit it on one hand. and you probably take 2 of those. So it's very few people. So these are some of the practical considerations when thinking about these things. And that's why I'm glad to be speaking about it on like an audience that potentially they will have legal representation, because some of these best cases probably will have some of that involved.
No, absolutely. Guys, listen, I mean, time is short here. So anyway, if you're listening, the 3 of us, Gary, Mike, and I are going to be doing this as a webinar. We're going to be doing it June 2nd. So look for an email to go out on that. If you don't see it, you can always email us. For those folks who want to get in touch with either Mike or Gary, I will put their emails in the description down below. So if you want to go ahead, and I'm sure, as Gary said, he'd be more than happy to listen to anything you or one of your clients has to say, as I know Mike and I would as well. And guys, listen, thanks for taking the time. I'm looking forward to doing the webinar on June 2nd, but thanks for taking the time today to do this. This is great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. And thank everyone for listening, and keep listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye. If you haven't already subscribed to the Tax Rep Network podcast, go to taxrepllc.com, mouse over resources, and click TRN podcast. You'll get an account loaded with all the episodes, our sponsor offers, and transcripts of recent podcast episodes. Thanks for listening, and thanks again to our sponsors, Call ENQ and Tax Help Software. See you on the next episode.